Welcome to a special edition of Bloomberg Technology Chip Crunch, a deep dive into the global semiconductor shortage as well as the search for solutions. I'm Emily Chang from San Francisco. This hour, we will hear from key players in this sprawling business like Micron CEO Sanjay Mehrotra, Global Foundry CEO Dr. Thomas Caulfield, and the man in charge of Amazon's processors, Vice President Dave Brown. But first, the problem. The COVID-19 pandemic last year spurred suppliers to cut production, not foreseeing a surge in demand from consumers at home, needing everything from new electronics to cars. As a result, that's left manufacturers and whole industries in a lurch.
COVID caused everybody to step back a bit from capacity and build out in the supply chain of the industry, and it induced a radical increase in demand. And now we're in a position that there's a meaningful shortage.
Obviously, the last year has been very, very difficult to deal with. Nobody knew which direction demand was going to go in, and we saw some real kind of sharp moves in different industries.
Our ability to meet demand is now paced by the supply availability, and everything is short. There's not a single industry that not being impacted by the semiconductor shortage, from automotive to IoT to home.
Here to break down what is driving the shortage that has thrown the global economy into crisis, Bloomberg's Ian King, who's covered the chip industry for 2 decades. Ian, how did it get this bad?
Well, as some of your guests just explained in those clips that you played, Emily, last year looked like the global economy was going really badly. All of the chip makers were getting forecasts from their customers saying, things are really bad, not sure we need that much. Then it actually turned out that demand was considerably stronger. And guess what? Here we are now where demand is really strong, and the chip makers really haven't sort of prepared for this surge, for this snap back.
So we've seen this movie before. It's not like this is the first chip shortage there's been in history, but how is this time different?
Yeah, I mean, it's different because we have the short-term trend, this trend where, if you build a car, it takes you about a week. If you build a smartphone, probably takes you a day. But if you build a chip, it's 3 months, right? Or it's 18 months to build a factory before you get any supply. So there's always been this fundamental disconnect between, the supply and demand trends. But what's gone on this year is we've seen a very unusual situation of some extreme weak forecasting and really an inability to meet that with short-term, supply increases. And then on top of that, and I think some of your guests later will tell you the same thing, the chip industry is arguing that, things have never been like this before. We're seeing an unprecedented kind of spread in the use of chips, everything from your washing machine to your car, to all of these new areas, to these obviously massive data centers that are a part of everybody's lives. Now, this long-term trend is coming on the back of this short-term spike.
Right, everything from cars to phones to appliances, home networking gear. There's also concern that China started stockpiling chips at the height of the trade war during the Trump years. How big a problem has that been? Has that exacerbated the situation?
Yeah, I mean, and on top of everything we just discussed, as you indicated, geopolitics has become an issue for the chip industry like never before. It's one of the most widely distributed industries in the world. Most chips are designed in the US and built in Asia, and that's never really been a problem before. But now the largest market for semiconductors is China, which takes more than half of the industry's sales. Suddenly there's tension between where those chips are designed and where they end up, and that's absolutely complicated things. We've had Huawei obviously banned from using a lot of American technology, and so it's natural that companies in that country would be stocking up, concerned about where the next chip is coming from.
All right, Ian King, who's been covering the industry for so long, will continue to follow your reporting on this. Thank you. Meantime, when Micron gave its second quarter earnings report, it told a story from 2 distinct perspectives. It's NAND memory chips that serve the data storage markets, and it's DRAM chips, which are widely used in laptops and other computing devices. The big takeaways: The DRAM supply will fall short of demand this year. That means prices will increase. In contrast, though, Micron said the supply of NAND flash will exceed demand, leading to more CapEx cuts. With the full picture, we've got Micron CEO Sanjay Mehrotra. Interesting tale of two cities there, Sanjay. Let's start with DRAM. Just how hard is it for you to meet the demand when it comes to supply?
Hello, Emily. Good to be on your show here today. With respect to DRAM, which represents more than 70% of Micron's business, of course, we announced during the time of the pandemic, we developed, and just a few weeks ago, we announced our 1-alpha DRAM technology node. This is the most advanced DRAM technology node by any supplier in the world. So Micron, during the pandemic, has been working hard on positioning itself to emerge stronger and prepared itself with the industry-leading 1-alpha node, which we are now ramping up into production and will be continuing to do so through the remainder of this year as well as next year. These are some CapEx investment decisions that we actually made at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, knowing that this is what is going to be needed in terms of meeting the growing demand. However, no question that end market demand from all segments of the end market, whether it is data center to the intelligent edge and smart user devices, all of these are requiring more of DRAM memory. So yes, DRAM is in tight supply at this point, and we expect the supply shortages to continue to be tighter through the rest of the year as well. And as we look ahead at 2022 as well, we see that the world economies will be rebounding, and the secular demand trends, again, from data center to smartphone to PCs to automobiles to intelligent devices, this trend will continue on, driving in this data economy more need for DRAM memory. So we see secular tailwinds in 2022 as well from the point of view of demand. And we are focused on continuing to bring our 1-alpha technology node to continue to increase our supply to help address the growing needs in the market for DRAM.
Now, President Biden has called chip industry leaders like yourself to Washington for a chip summit next week. Will you be attending that? And what would you like to see from the administration that could help?
So Emily, you know that Micron is a company that has a very well-diversified global footprint. And of course, here in the US, we are the only manufacturer of semiconductor memory and storage. And we engage with the governments, with the administrations from around the world where we have presence in terms of our manufacturing or sales capabilities. So we engage with the governments. We are always in the dialogue. And I'm very pleased to see the focus in the US government on semiconductor industry, because semiconductor industry absolutely forms the backbone of global economies today. As we just discussed, as Ian King earlier mentioned as well, that from everything in your home to your cities, to your data centers, to the devices in your pockets, you need semiconductors today. So we are pleased with the focus that the administration is providing on driving research as well as manufacturing capabilities and strengthening innovation and competitiveness of the US semiconductor industry. This really bodes well for the long term. So we are definitely happy to see this focus coming to semiconductor industry.
Okay. Microns plants are in Virginia, Singapore, Japan. You also have one in Utah that you're in the middle of selling. Why sell that plant now when we're in the midst of a chip shortage? And obviously, the US government wants more manufacturing on US soil.
So very important to note that yes, Micron has a manufacturing plant for DRAM and NAND solutions in Manassas, Virginia. And we have the world's best R&D center in Boise, Idaho as well for our DRAM, NAND, and emerging memory solutions. And around the world, in countries like Singapore, Taiwan, and Japan, we have wafer manufacturing capabilities as well. So in memory and storage, in wafer manufacturing, scale is critically important. So scale and cost competitiveness is critical key factor here. Our Lehi, Utah factory was dedicated not to NAND or DRAM manufacturing, but it was dedicated to solutions called 3D crosspoint technology, which for various reasons, engaging with the customer ecosystem, we have decided to cease the development of because the return on our investments, given the limited market opportunity, really did not justify ongoing investments in that technology. However, that plant in Lehi, Utah, really has a strong team, tremendous capability, and it will fit in well with other potential acquirers for either logic or analog or for foundry services. So we are engaged in dialogue with them for the sale of the plant.
Well, speaking of dialogue, you've got the China issue as well. The U.S. needs the China market. China needs U.S. chips, but there's been this stockpiling issue, trade tensions. Do you think the relationship can get back to where it was pre-Trump? Do you think Biden will soften his stance? Or do you think this just gives China impetus to make more of its own chips?
So for U.S. semiconductor industry, again, as Ian had earlier noted, that China is an important market. And China market absolutely provides the benefit of scale that I was referring to, which is important to semiconductors and certainly important to memory and storage. So we are partner to several customers in China as well. So for US semiconductor industry, in order to have global competitiveness and not to be deprived of the opportunities around the globe by some other foreign competitors, it is important for us to be able to continue to participate in the China market, of course, while watching for national security interests or other government rules and regulations. So I do believe that it behooves US and China to really resolve the matters that are important so that innovation can flourish across national geographies, across national boundaries on a level playing field that absolutely addresses matters related to IP protection, as well as fair, open market as well.
Now, last question quickly, Sanjay, about oversupply. Obviously, you're seeing this in the NAND business. I wonder if you're going to see the pendulum swing the other way. Once the shortage is over, will there be an oversupply? Quickly.
So Emily, last week in our earnings call, we noted that we have seen early signs of stabilizing of pricing in the NAND industry. We do watch and monitor that optimistically. But we do think that in order to really restore the health of the NAND industry, some prudent CapEx investment CapEx management is necessary so that the supply bit growth doesn't outrun the demand growth in the NAND industry. And this is where Micron certainly is being extremely disciplined in terms of how we manage our CapEx investments in DRAM as well as NAND, absolutely focusing on driving our supply bit growth, keeping in mind long-term demand expectations as well. And that is critically important for maintaining the health of both DRAM and NAND industries.
All right, Micron CEO Sanjay Mehrotra, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be watching to see if you're at that summit next week at the White House. Our sources telling us that you will be there, so we will be following that. And coming up, the view from the chip giants. We're going to hear from the chief executives of Intel, Qualcomm, and ARM, as well as a big chip customer, and that is IBM, when they think things will level out and the impact of US-China tensions. You are watching Bloomberg Technology Chip Crunch. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to a special edition of Bloomberg Technology Chip Crunch. Chip lead times, the gap between ordering a chip and taking delivery, increased to 16 weeks in March. That means more supply anxiety. It and geopolitical tensions between the US and China on everyone's mind, including the chief executives of Qualcomm, ARM, IBM, and Intel.
You are talking about companies having to invest tens of billions of dollars in capex, in equipment, in building the clean room that manufacture wafers. So it's an equation that you've got to get very, very right, because we've been here before. The industry has had too much supply, chip prices plummet, and it reduces investment in raw R&D. So I think over the years, the industry has got a lot better at analyzing supply and demand, and then it's generally got better at investing at the right pace so that we can have a balance of capacity and R&D.
We're still growing as a company, but as we had said in the last earnings call, our ability to meet demand is now paced by the supply availability, and everything is short. There's not a single industry that not being impacted by the semiconductor shortage, from automotive to IoT to home, and it's just because of all those different trends that accelerated consumption of semiconductor that we saw during the pandemic. We have line of sight that demand and supply are going to align by the end of this calendar year.
Whenever you get a constraint in a supply chain and you find that the sources and the manufacturing is down to one or two regions, this is going to last a few years. This is not a few months or a few weeks. So we should be clear about the impact. It's going to last that long. Then you say you've got to solve it. So we are working together with Intel because we do believe that there should be alternate sources of fabrication. And we do believe there should be competitive advantages in the more advanced nodes that are to come.
There's very few companies that can step into advanced semiconductor technology, something that we've only used for our internal needs at scale before. But now we're saying we're going to open our fab doors wide for the industry. And with that in mind, customers are looking and saying, I only have TSMC, Samsung, and Intel as the leading choices, and only one of those is on Western US and European soil at scale. Wow, I need a more balanced supply chain. I want to have at least two suppliers of my advanced technology choices. And Intel is saying we are going to be that. The world needs more semiconductors. The world needs a more balanced supply chain. We're one of the few companies that can step in to do that.
Our business in China is remaining very strong. Many licensees are adopting new technology from us. So the business day to day is continuing well. Despite
the tension, our business with China has been growing at an incredible rate. And I think we're very privileged, our position. We resolved our license dispute with Huawei, and now we're growing, including with new customers like Honor. I'm optimistic that for areas like in the technology sector, like we are in 5G, we play a very important role for both the growth in the United States as well for the companies in China.
We need to be at scale across the business, but we do think it takes a couple of years to build this out, as designs take time to be committed to a new process and then test and ramping in manufacturing. But we're underway. We already have some existing foundry customers at small scale that will start ramping up more rapidly. So this business will get underway. We've estimated the overall foundry market at $100 billion by 2025, and we're going to earnestly pursue a meaningful portion of that.
Building a fab is not something that you throw up overnight. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of investment. Over the last number of years, the manufacturing industry really has invested a lot of capex in building up capacity. Obviously, the last year has been very, very difficult to deal with. Nobody knew which direction demand was going to go in, and we saw some real kind of sharp moves in different industries. So it will right itself. There will be investment in more capacity, and ultimately, we will get back to a position where supply and demand are better matched.
We'll hear more from those CEOs later in the show. Also coming up, what Wall Street is saying about semis. We're going to talk to longtime chip analyst Joanne Feeney with Advisors Capital Management. And as we head to break, industry watchers with recent notes on chip demand and supply into the future. You're watching Bloomberg Technology, Chip Crunch.
The major issue is that the lead time is so long and the capital investment is tremendous. Okay, so it takes time to recover or to fulfill this surging needs.
Welcome back to a special Bloomberg Technology Chip Crunch. That was the Asia Pacific Vice President for the World Semiconductor Trade Statistics. That group predicts the global semiconductor market is expected to increase by 10.9% in 2021, translating to sales of $488 billion with a longtime analyst take. I want to bring in Joanne Feeney of Advisors Capital Management. So Joanne, we've heard conflicting opinions about when this will end. We heard the CEO of Qualcomm saying maybe by the end of the year, other CEOs saying it's going to take a lot longer than that. What do you think? How long does this last?
This is going to take a while, Emily. As we talked about a month ago, it takes a long time to ramp up capacity. As you know, to build more factories is just going to take too long, and we have the big backlog of demand out of the auto industry and other places. So, we don't expect this to clear up until into 2022, which is a good thing actually for some of the semiconductor companies because they're selling a whole lot of chips.
So on that note, we've seen a big run up in chip stocks. Do you think they can keep going higher, or is the run over?
No, I think they can keep going higher. In fact, if you're real careful, we select individual stocks for our clients. Look at some of the opportunities out there now. Again, a month ago, we've seen about a 15% rise in Taiwan Semi and Texas Instruments, which we hold for clients. But, Qualcomm has only gone up about half that much. It's actually traded down from its peak. Taiwan Semi is down from its peak. There are good opportunities for investors to get into some of these stocks that have a really long tailwind because of all this pent-up demand and the new construction that's coming in the future. So good opportunities out there right now.
So you've said Intel's manufacturing has really fallen off. They've been doubling down. What are the chances they get back to that leadership position? Who do they then take share from? What does it mean for an AMD?
Well, I think as Pat Gelsinger has correctly pointed out, Intel definitely has some work to do to bring their manufacturing up to speed, up to the leading edge. And they recognize that. It's going to take them, though, a number of years to do it. So, AMD, by outsourcing, has a continuing advantage. I think they continue to gain share in the data centers, in PCs. And so that's an opportunity. We'll see whether Intel's current plan really will work. It's sort of a stretch, though, to believe that a lot of their competitors are going to want to turn to Intel for manufacturing. So I think Intel has a tough road to hoe here. And I wouldn't be looking at Intel as one of the places where it would be best to invest in the semiconductor space at this point. Texas Instruments, NXPI, I think is a great opportunity. We've owned it for a long time for clients. And as I said, Taiwan Semi and Qualcomm, whose CEO you had on a bit earlier, also has a very good road ahead of them in terms of growth.
All right. Thanks so much for helping us map out that road ahead. Joanne Feeney, Advisors Capital Management. Appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much. Okay, coming up, we're going to take a global look at how the chip shortage is impacting the global economy. We're going to head to Asia and Europe and look at the winners and the losers in this crisis. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. You're watching a special episode of Bloomberg Technology Chip Crunch. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Well, from cars to home appliances to smartphones, a global chip shortage is having a ripple effect through supply chains and crunching company margins. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow reports.
Semiconductors, or chips, are essential components in things we use every day. They're made from the material that gave Silicon Valley its name, and they handle everything from artificial intelligence processing to simple functions like translating the press of a button into an electronic signal. Think of them as the brain of a device. So what happened? When the pandemic shut down car factories in March, automakers expected less orders for passenger vehicles, so in turn cut their orders for chips. At the same time, working from home and 5G drove demand for laptops, smartphones, cloud services, and data centers, so those industries increased their orders for semiconductors. That caused chip makers to switch production to those areas rather than pile up chips they couldn't sell. But what both car and computer companies didn't expect was a quick rebound in demand for their products. So here lies the problem. There's now not enough supply to meet demand, and building chip factories takes years and costs billions of dollars.
The answer in the near term is nothing can be done in a grand way that can infuse supply. Supply expansion takes time, takes addition of new factories, addition of new capacity.
How bad could it get? Chip shortages are expected to wipe out $61 billion of sales for automakers alone. And big chip makers like Qualcomm, NXP, and Infineon say the auto industry isn't the only sector to get hurt. Games console makers say things will get worse before they get better, potentially impacting holiday sales. President Biden has signed an executive order to look into why the US is so reliant on overseas chip manufacturers like Taiwan's TSMC and South Korea's Samsung.
Companies such as Qualcomm, AMD, NVIDIA, all of these companies don't have factories of their own and rely on third-party manufacturers, and over the last decade or so have become extremely reliant on TSMC.
So how long before supply meets up with demand? Well, it's a guessing game, but some analysts say we won't see signs of a turnaround until the second half of the year. Ed Ludlow, Bloomberg News, San Francisco.
So, could we see a turnaround in the second half of the year? A full recovery in a few years? The outlook on that is mixed, but one thing is for sure, the demand for semiconductors around the world is soaring, and one industry being hit hard by the shortage is autos, with plants being idled while they wait for that one thing, chips.
And remember, all it takes is one chip to prevent you from manufacturing an automobile or shipping a computer. What I'm seeing and talking to both the suppliers but also customers is it's a cycle that's going to go into next calendar year.
The home is everything now, and people want all this digital capability in the home, which means the demands for chips is through the roof. I don't even think the manufacturers know the end of this story.
It's a serious topic. The whole industry is affected. The capacity is too low. For all players like automotive industry and consumer electronics.
An industry which was even increasing last year in demand, in particular in the second quarter with all the lockdowns which happened in home office supplies. That's where the automotive industry was in a standstill. And that's where, since then, the automotive industry is in a catch-up mode.
We are keenly watching the development of the chip as well as battery supply chain. So far, it hasn't impacted us. We also have not seen that impacting our forecast for the first quarter.
Of course, we're working every single day with a cross-functional team to look for opportunities of how do we minimize the impact. So we'll continue to do that. And so it's a year of execution. And you know, the issues with chips, this is a short-term issue, and we'll work through it.
Once you get these chips, you have to decide. And you can look at your stocking factors, you can look at your profit margins, and of course, put them into the vehicles where you have the best margins and the tightest supply. So it's going to be chaotic and challenging, but I think we can navigate through it, still being able to hit our retail targets for this year.
Joining me now for a closer look at how the silicon shortage is affecting the globe, we're joined by Bloomberg anchor Caroline Hyde from London and our Bloomberg News editor Peter Elstrom in Tokyo. Caroline, I want to start with you and a look at Europe. We just heard from a number of car makers there. How is the shortage impacting them across the region? Who's getting hurt the most?
Well, the automakers specifically, a number of them coming out. Some of the truck makers, Volvo, for example, already saying they've got substantial impact in terms of the supply chain being hit. We've also had the likes of Volkswagen. You're hearing from the US head there, but they've had to idle manufacturing in Portugal. You're hearing from Stellantis, which is how PSA and Fiat came together. They've had plenty of knock-on effects in terms of their US production capacity. So certainly the automakers. You also heard from Continental in that sort of string of people speaking there. They're an auto supplier, part supplier. They're lobbying the likes of the governments, asking Taiwan government too, not just its own German government, to really lend a hand here, stop putting automakers at the back of the queue. But there are winners, and we've got some chip makers here in Europe, and they're doing pretty well. ST Micro, the likes of NXP doing well as well, Infineon, and notably the chip equipment makers, Emily. ASML, one of its biggest customer is TSMC. So when TSMC says it's going to spend $100 billion more on beefing up its own capacity, well, they're going to win out by it.
TSMC, of course, the dominant foundry and based in Taiwan. We're going to talk to Peter about that shortly. But Caroline, let's talk a little bit about the EU's plan. They have a plan. What's the plan, and will it work?
there's a plan. There's perhaps not much detail on how they enact that plan, but yeah, they've got this so-called digital compass that they've come up with, and big and bold, Emily, as always politics tends to be here. 2030, they want to be really doubling down on the most efficient chips. By 2030, in fact, they say they want to be making about 20%, so 1/5 of all the value that's coming out of the chip sector. They have, as I say, got some chip makers here, the likes of ST Micro and XP, but really there's questions coming from the local executives as to whether the demand is there for the very high-end, high-level chips. Because remember, I mean, we make a lot of autos in Europe, but I'm not seeing many phone makers. I'm not seeing many consumer electronics makers. So is the demand really there, particularly as you're going to have a lot of subsidies fed into this to make this a real financial commitment? So question marks from the sector itself, and also question marks coming from TSMC itself too.
Absolutely. Let's talk about that next. Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde in London. Thanks so much for the view from Europe. Let's get to Asia now. We're joined by Bloomberg's Peter Elstrom, our executive editor for tech coverage in Asia. So, Peter, TSMC has said during this crisis it's going to spend more than $100 billion over the next 3 years to expand its chip-making abilities. Is it a problem that TSMC dominates the foundry business so much? Does that somehow exacerbate the shortage that others are feeling?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's certainly a bottleneck. They've invested so much money over the years to take this place as sort of the premier foundry where they do these customized chips for companies like Apple and NVIDIA and many others. And right now they're spending a ton of money to be able to catch up with this surging demand. It's not a challenge for them, of course. They have tons of business. They're investing tons and tons at this point, but it is a challenge if you're sitting in Europe, as Caroline was talking about, or you're sitting in the United States and you're concerned about whether your companies are going to be able to get enough chips. And these efforts that you see in the US and in Europe to build more domestic capacity, it's going to take too long to be able to address this particular shortage in the chip industry. But long-term, they're thinking long-term in these places, and they're using this as an opportunity to get some money for investments that they've wanted to make for a very long time.
Now, it's not just the EU, but the US and China that are all trying to build more domestic capacity. How does geopolitics factor into this situation?
Well, it's a very big question. And we're seeing that right now, not just because of the chip shortage, but because of the tensions between the United States and China. The US has cut off a few key companies in China. Huawei is probably the most notable, where they've said, we're not going to send you the cutting edge chips that you need to build smartphones, for example. That has motivated the Chinese government to double down on this effort that they've been trying to execute for years to build their own domestic chip industry. They're far, far behind. They don't have the capabilities of TSMC. They don't have the capabilities of a Samsung or an Intel at this point, but they feel like this is a key sign that they need to build their own domestic chip industry. They'll do it slowly. They'll do it methodically. We saw in the latest 5-year plan that they're going to dedicate billions of dollars to doing this. And they're more determined than ever because they've seen how vulnerable they are when it comes to something like the US cutting off Huawei and a few other companies there.
All right. Bloomberg's Peter Elstrom in Tokyo. Thanks so much for the view from your side of the world. All right, coming up, tech giants Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon are getting into the chip design and manufacturing business. We're going to talk to Amazon Vice President Dave Brown about the company's own efforts to make chips as its massive cloud business expands. It's also happening at Apple, Google, Microsoft, and more. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to a Bloomberg Technology special, Chip Crunch. As Amazon has transformed to a cloud computing giant, it stands as one of the world's largest chip purchasers. Those chips are used to power data centers, and as AWS continues to expand, it's increasingly looking for opportunities to design its own chips instead of buying them. It's part of a larger trend by other companies like Apple, Google, and Microsoft, and it's seen as a major threat to traditional chip makers like Intel. Joining us now to discuss, Dave Brown, Vice President at Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud. He leads all products that contain AWS design processors. Dave, thank you so much for joining us. So chip design is a massive investment for you. Then it's the process of getting it all manufactured. Why is Amazon doing this?
Well, thanks, Emily. It's great to be here today. You know, our focus on custom silicon is really focused on customers. It's our customer obsession that's driving us. And what customers are really looking for is more performance and lower cost. And when we took a look at the chip space, we realized that over the last couple of years, a number of years actually, since the early 2000s, we've only seen about a 10 to 15% improvement in performance in the chip space, which is a lot less than what customers had back in the 90s. And we thought, given our investment in infrastructure already as a cloud provider, there was a lot we could do there. And so we focused on how do we build the most advanced, fastest ARM-based CPU or server chip for our customers. And we did that with our server chip called Graviton 2, which is allowing our customers to actually improve their performance by about 40% at about a 20% reduction in cost. And you know how important performance and cost reduction are for customers. And so bringing that to AWS has allowed customers to bring their workloads and just be able to do more at a lower cost.
Now, you're not just making chips for servers, but also, as I understand it, voice recognition, graphics, AI, machine learning, and as you've said, you've proven you're pretty good at it. Does that mean that Alexa and our Kindles will have Amazon design chips as well?
Oh, likely over time, absolutely. You know, we actually started our custom silicon journey all the way back in 2010. And so this is not just something we've been doing recently. It's something we realized we had to do as a cloud provider in the very early days of AWS. We actually purchased a chip manufacturing company called Annapurna Labs back in 2014. And they've built no fewer than 11 different chips for us today. And so that's the server chip in Graviton. We do have chips in the machine learning space with Inferentia and Trainium that are coming out. And it's very likely that you'll continue to see us innovate in this space, as long as it makes sense for our customers, which is what we're always looking at. How do we improve our customer experience? And that drives us.
Now, Google and Microsoft are also making their own chips and also have big cloud businesses. And I'm curious, how do you think your efforts compare to theirs, or how do you think your efforts give you an advantage over what they're doing?
Well, you know, we try not to, at Amazon, we try not to focus too much on what our competitors are doing, but stay focused on what customers are seeing. You know, we've been very early to the ARM game. As I said, we started back in 2010. We worked very closely with ARM over the last number of years. And we put out our first ARM chip actually back in 2018 and really actually sparked an ecosystem. We signaled to the market that an ARM server chip was available in the cloud. And we've just seen customers like Snap with their Snapchat application, seen customers like Honeycode.io, and even our own Alexa start using this custom silicon. And it's growing from small startups to large enterprises. And so I guess the one advantage we have, it's available today. You know, we've seen customers like Twitter even decide to choose AWS as their primary cloud provider because the goal of moving more and more of their workloads to ARM. And so it's available today on AWS for customers to use, and we're going to continue innovating in this space with what we've built, the muscle we've built internally to be able to build this custom silicon.
So clearly this is more than just a side hustle or a hobby. Do you think that this is something you could turn into an external business and sell Amazon designed chips to other companies?
Well, right now we're really focused on what chips do we have to bring into our cloud environment. And we do have the ability to put some of these chips into customer data centers as well, you know, through our Outpost program where we can bring AWS to you. Over time, I guess it's interesting to see where it'll go. It's difficult to know where we'll be in 5 years' time or how innovation will take us or what customer demand is going to be. So I certainly wouldn't say no to that question, but it's not something we're currently planning.
Now, your CEO, Jeff Bezos, weighed in positively on President Biden's infrastructure plan, and there's this big chip summit happening in Washington next week. If there's one thing the administration could do that you believe would help the industry, what would that be?
Well, you know, I think there's obviously a lot of focus right now in supply chain and making sure that we have enough chips. On the Amazon side, you know, we've been innovating in our supply chain. It's kind of in the DNA of what Amazon does. So obviously making sure that there's enough chips available for demand is critically important. We're actually very confident in where we are from a supply chain point of view at this point in time. And we've been able to withstand things, you know, like we had in COVID last year with an incredible demand on cloud capacity. But obviously making sure that we have the necessary, you know, supply and whatever we can do there would be critical for everyone involved.
All right. Dave Brown, Vice President at Amazon, thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting to hear more about the work you're doing there and work to come. All right, still ahead. We're going to speak to the CEO of Global Foundries, Tom Caulfield, who will be attending President Biden's Chip Summit next week. His thoughts on the competition with TSMC and Samsung and when the chip shortage will be over. This is Bloomberg Technology, Chip Crunch. Welcome back to a special Bloomberg Technology Chip Crunch. When it comes to the foundry business, the business of making chips for other companies, manufacturers in Taiwan and South Korea dominate. TSMC and Samsung leading the charge. In the U.S., it's UMC and Global Foundries, the top players. To compete on the global stage, Global Foundries says it's committed to expanding production in the U.S., Europe, and Singapore. Joining us now for more, Global Foundries CEO himself, Tom Caulfield. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. So I would love to hear what it's like from your vantage point. How hard is it right now to keep up with demand?
Well, first, Emily, thank you for having me here today. I think how we got ourselves in this position of this big shortage is really a journey that started about 15 years ago with the advent of the smartphone. We started to see that a compute-centric industry, that was one that went to the smallest and tiniest transistors to do compute function only, started to evolve to, wow, look at all the features we can put in devices. So we could put a touch screen. We could put secure transactions so we can do pay remotely from the cash register. We could put audio chips. We could use our phone to take pictures. We have a touch screen that is easier to manipulate through features on the phone. We have power management chips to make the battery last longer. And all of a sudden, this industry went from a compute-centric mindset, we went down kind of scaling Moore's law, to pervasive deployment of semiconductors. And by the way, that's where GF plays. All those functions I described is where we make chips for our customers, 250 of them strong. We make them worldwide. And so what really happened was the beginning of that journey 15 years ago from a compute-centric industry to a pervasive compute became accelerated. You know, the unfortunate pandemic of 2020 really had technology adoption that normally would take a decade, happened essentially in a year. And not only are more devices being sold, more content of semiconductors go in each device. And so we entered the pandemic with the industry thinking we had a 5% growth. We're today looking out, the industry for the next 5 years has a 9% growth. And as you've heard earlier on your program, putting capacity on is not something you just do in a week. It's by the minute you say go, and I'm going to order equipment, a company like GF, it's probably a year out before we can produce just the wafers, not even the final product for our customers. We have to buy the equipment, install the equipment, qualify the equipment, and then begin production. And so this shortage is going to be with us well into 2022. I don't think the demand is perishable. I think it stays.
Now, you will be attending the CHIP Summit at the White House next week. What is the one thing that you would like President Biden to do?
Well, I certainly seen all the reporting as well on the plans for this meeting. I don't have any specifics on that meeting, but I can tell you, there's a tremendous amount of energy and interest in semiconductors in Washington. And as a key player in the U.S. and globally, GF is included in these discussions. Our job is to provide constructive input, perspective. What's the types of industrial policy that can help the U.S. achieve its objectives? I think the important thing right now is let's get that CHIPS bill funded so that we can accelerate manufacturing capacity in the U.S.
Let's talk about that because TSMC is the biggest player in the foundry market, then it's Samsung, and you are, of course, a big player in the United States. But do you believe that's problematic, especially when it comes to U.S. and China competitiveness and, the speculation that China has been stockpiling chips through the trade war?
Look, I think, we say, what are we trying to solve here? The U.S. has led the semiconductor industry since the beginning. The U.S. invented the transistor. And if you look at this $500 billion semiconductor industry we all participate in, about 50% of that industry is supported by U.S. headquartered companies, but only 12% is manufactured in the U.S. And this is what's creating that dynamic, that issue, supply chain security, national security, and even economic. I mean, semiconductors are at the heart of a $91 trillion world economy. And all regions of the world, China, Europe, want to make sure that they have the capability to build semiconductors. The U.S. now is adjusting industrial policy so that they could make the investments other regions of the world have made in partnership with business to create more manufacturing in the U.S.
Now, we're all waiting, last quick question, Tom, for Global Foundries to go public. Wouldn't now be a good time when there's all this surge in demand? Are you accelerating your timeline? Could we see it this year?
I think for us, it's always been about going to the public markets when we hit certain financial and performance targets for our business to make sure we capture the true value of this enterprise. And that discussion's always been in, sometime in 2022. We always view our strategic alternatives, but for us right now, we are laser focused on continuing to get as much out of the capacity we have on the ground now and investing as fast as we can to increase this capacity so that we can help do our part in getting this supply demand better aligned.
All right. Global Foundry CEO Thomas Caulfield, we will be following through the year and into the next and your path to IPO. Thanks so much for joining us. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology Chip Crunch. We're going to continue to cover the chip crisis as it unfolds. We'll be watching that summit at the White House next week. And another note on programming, my latest Studio 1.0 featuring Melinda Gates. Coming up, she is the co-chair, of course, of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which just gave $1.75 billion to fight the global pandemic. She'll talk about the future of women. She's worried about women backsliding post-pandemic. You can catch that conversation coming up on Bloomberg Television. I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.